The Duke of Ravensshire stood beneath the grand chandelier, a constellation of crystal droplets that trembled with every whispered laugh, and yet he appeared as unmoved as the marble pillars lining the ballroom. The candles flickered like nervous hearts around him, casting fractured shadows across his angular features. Outside, the winter wind clawed at the windows, carrying the distant wail of carriage wheels along cobblestone streets, but within, the air was thick with perfume and gossip, a scent more suffocating than any frost. He had returned from the continent only a fortnight prior, his reputation preceding him like a herald of war and whispered proprieties, yet tonight he found himself trapped in a lattice of expectation, poised between admiration and disdain. Lady Evelyn Hartwell entered the ballroom with a measured grace, her gloves a soft cream, her gown a muted violet that seemed almost too modest for the glittering assembly. She was the daughter of a nobleman recently fallen from fortune. Her position precarious in the eyes of society, yet there was a dignity in her carriage that no amount of whispered censure could diminish. Her dark hair was pulled back in a careful knot, her eyes wide and unyielding, as if daring the world to name her shame. And perhaps she did, though the name remained unspoken, floating instead in the tensely held breaths of those around her. Evelyn's intent that evening was neither rebellion nor vanity, but gratitude. Her father, now gone, had been aided discreetly by the Duke in securing the family estate from creditors. Tonight, she would express her thanks, a gesture small in action yet monumental in her trembling heart. She approached him with quiet resolve, each step a measured defiance of the invisible wall society had erected between them. The Duke noticed her before she spoke, his gaze a mixture of appraisal and suppressed curiosity. His eyes, dark and fathomless, betrayed nothing, yet Evelyn felt, even in that first heartbeat, that they were assessing her, weighing her very presence. "Your Grace," she said, voice soft but clear, rising above the discreet strains of a distant violin. "I am grateful for your kindness to my late father. Without it—" She faltered, not from uncertainty, but from the palpable weight of every eye upon her. The Duke's lips curved in a shadow of amusement, almost imperceptible, yet cruel in its subtlety. He inclined his head, but only slightly, his tone as cold as the frost that pressed against the ballroom windows. "Lady Evelyn, you mistake gratitude for presumption," he said, each word precise, deliberate, and cutting. "You are not of my world." The phrase fell like a blade, its sharpness magnified by the silence that followed. A ripple of laughter, polite and pointed, spread across the room. Guests whispered behind fans and delicate hands, their voices carrying the sting of judgment. Even the musicians faltered for a note, as if recognizing that the air itself had become electric with discomfort. Evelyn's gloved hands tightened at her sides, and for a moment she seemed suspended in the room's opulent gravity, a fragile figure of defiance against the social tide. The scent of roses from the nearby arrangements mingled with the faint tang of candle smoke, creating an atmosphere of perfume and regret. She bowed her head, a gesture of acknowledgment, though not of submission, and turned with a composure that belied the flush rising to her cheeks. Yet even in her retreat, the Duke's gaze lingered. It was not merely observation, but a careful inspection, a measuring of some intangible worth that society refused to name. Beneath the mask of indifference, a flicker of something unclaimed stirred within him. Admiration? Pity? Or perhaps the first hesitant pulse of recognition that the woman before him was unlike any other. The murmurs of the crowd swelled as Evelyn passed between clusters of guests, their curiosity sharpened by scandal's subtle hand. One lady, her eyes like polished jet, leaned toward another. "The Duke. Has he not forgotten his manners? To dismiss her so." "Indeed," the second whispered, her fan fluttering in nervous rhythm. "And yet, there is something about her. Do you not feel it?" The Duke's expression remained unreadable, but his hand tightened around the crystal stem of his glass, leaving a faint indentation in the polished surface. For the briefest instant, it trembled, a betrayal of the inner tumult he neither acknowledged nor permitted. Evelyn descended the steps leading from the ballroom onto the polished parquet, her breath catching not from exertion but from the sudden, strange heaviness that filled her chest. Shame, yes, but interwoven with a spark of something that puzzled her, a recognition, almost imperceptible, that he was not entirely cruel, that perhaps behind his dismissal lay a curiosity or admiration he dared not voice. The sensation was bitter, like a candle's smoke curling in the wind, both visible and ephemeral, burning yet intangible. her reflection caught in the gilded mirror at the hall's entrance, the soft purple of her gown a muted halo around her small, composed figure. She paused, heart quickened, aware of the silent audience her own image provided. And then, a sound, soft, deliberate, almost inaudible over the din of the departing musicians, a faint clink of crystal. The Duke's glass had fractured in his hand. He stood, still poised among the throngs, as the shard of stem fell unnoticed to the floor. A minor detail, trivial to any observer, yet to him it was a signal of a disturbance that neither the ballroom nor society could contain. For in the simple act of breaking there was truth. The facade of pride, the armor of detachment, had faltered for but a heartbeat. Evelyn, sensing no audience beyond her own apprehension, allowed herself a fleeting glance back. Their eyes met. Just once. And in that instant, both recognized a fracture far deeper than any crystal chandelier could embody. A silent acknowledgment passed, unspoken and forbidden, heavier than the courtesies and constraints that bound them. She continued down the hall, her steps steady despite the tremor in her hands. The soft rustle of her gown sounded like distant thunder in the marble corridors. Behind her, the Duke remained, statuesque yet subtly altered, a shadow of uncertainty flickering in his steadfast gaze. The room, the guests, the laughter, all persisted in oblivion, yet for them, the world had shifted imperceptibly, irrevocably. The final echoes of her departure lingered like smoke in the chandeliers. The Duke's knuckles whitened around his glass, and though no one noticed, his eyes followed her reflection in the mirror one last time. In that reflection, he saw not just the young woman who dared to approach him, but the first tremors of something he had long denied, a curiosity of heart, a fragile stir of longing, and a reckoning with pride that could not yet speak her name aloud. And as the candles guttered low, throwing shadows that danced like silent spectators, the ballroom held its breath. Outside, the winter wind howled against the glass, indifferent to fortunes, whispers, and hearts yet unclaimed. But within, the world had shifted, if only slightly, and a game of restraint and desire had begun, one whose consequences neither crystal nor gossip could contain. Rain pelted the estate windows in relentless sheets, tapping against the leaded glass with a rhythm both urgent and accusatory. Inside, the corridors of Ravensshire House smelled of polished oak and damp wool, candles guttering as though they too feared the tempest outside. Lady Evelyn Hartwell entered the main hall with quiet purpose, the hems of her gown brushing against the cold flagstones. Weeks had passed since that fateful evening in the ballroom, yet the sting of humiliation lingered, woven into her very posture. She had resolved, after many sleepless nights, to vanish from the world that had condemned her dignity. Yet circumstances had other designs. The Duchess Dowager, a stern figure wrapped in sable furs, had dispatched a letter under the guise of propriety, requesting Evelyn's service as governess to the Duke's orphaned niece. Evelyn had hesitated, aware of the Duke's prior rebuke, the whispering courtiers, the invisible boundary drawn between them by rank and pride. And yet she arrived, compelled by necessity, a delicate figure of elegance and humility, stepping into the household where her past had been rendered public spectacle. The Duke returned from London that evening, his carriage wheels striking sparks from the wet cobblestones. His entrance was precise, controlled, and yet it radiated an authority that seemed to bend the very air around him. He paused at the threshold of the hall, eyes scanning the familiar interior. When they met hers, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, quickly replaced by the mask of indifference. He bowed formally, and the polite murmur of servants filled the silence that hung between them like a shroud. "You are here," he said, his voice low and measured, betraying nothing of the turmoil that might lie beneath. "The house is yours to traverse, but mind the proprieties of the household." Evelyn inclined her head, refusing the tremor of surprise that threatened her composure. Each word he spoke seemed to both command and protect, a curious contradiction that made her pulse quicken. She had anticipated anger, or perhaps outright dismissal, yet in his tone there was a restraint that suggested a quiet, simmering intrigue, an unspoken acknowledgment of her presence that neither dared name aloud. The first days passed in an uneasy equilibrium. The Duke's scrutiny was constant yet subtle, a glance that lingered too long, the faint curl of his lip when she corrected a child's misstep, a hand brushing hers ever so briefly when passing tea. Each gesture, seemingly mundane, became a token of tension, the weight of which neither dared articulate. And then, a discovery. A small, ornate pocket watch, lying forgotten in the corner of a drawer, engraved with initials long familiar to both families. It had belonged to her father, once entrusted to the Duke's late brother, now a bridge between the past and this tense present. Evelyn held it, fingers trembling, and in that simple token, memories and meaning collided. The household began to whisper. Servants, ever attuned to the undercurrents of aristocratic life, noticed the subtle exchanges. The Duke's gaze that followed her through the corridors, the way her voice caught when replying to him, the quiet defiance that lingered in her stance. Society, as ever, was quick to inflate rumor into scandal. A whispered comment in the village market, a note passed at a neighbor's dinner, "The Duke and his governess, what impropriety!" Each repetition added weight, a stone pressing upon Evelyn's dignity. One evening, the Duke summoned her to the library. Rain streaked the windows, silver rivulets blurring the dark shelves of leather-bound volumes. He had found a small signet ring, lost weeks before in a drawer, and its presence alone seemed to imbue the room with electricity. He held it out, eyes glinting with an emotion she could not yet name. "You dropped this," he said, voice restrained but taut. "I trust you do not consider such carelessness indicative of your character." Evelyn inclined her head, the faintest quiver betraying her attempt at composure. "It is of no consequence, Your Grace. I should have noticed sooner." He studied her, the faintest shadow crossing his face. "You are diligent in other matters, yet some distractions are evidently unavoidable." The words were innocent enough, yet in the stillness of that library, each syllable was a spark landing dangerously close to kindling. The following day, society's whispers grew louder. Evelyn was seen leaving the library at midnight, her cloak drawn tight against the chill, carrying nothing but a faint scent of lilac and old parchment. Observers interpreted the scene as illicit, scandalous, a flirtation with danger. In truth, she had merely returned the Duke's lost signet ring, yet perception is a mistress far more cruel than reality. The rumors spread like fire through dry grass, leaving both families and servants entangled in the heat of public judgment. The Duke's response was subtle yet undeniable. At breakfast, he said nothing of the accusations, yet his glances lingered, heavy with unspoken meaning. A servant's slip, a spilled cup of tea, the errant cough of a chambermaid, all were filtered through his scrutiny, yet none drew reproach. In private, his restraint was absolute. In public, his silence was more potent than defense. Evelyn began to sense the oscillation of his attention, alternately attentive, distant, a pendulum swinging between curiosity and propriety. One afternoon, the children played in the garden, the rain finally easing into a gentle drizzle, mist curling among the hedges. Evelyn paused to adjust a collar, and the Duke's hand brushed against hers in the exchange of a book. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it resonated with a tension neither could entirely dismiss. The storm of gossip, the weight of familial expectation, the shadow of public opinion. Yet in that single moment, a silent acknowledgment passed between them, intimate and forbidden. Evenings grew colder. The library fires burned long into the night, casting flickering shadows that seemed to mirror their private unrest. Every glance, every gesture, became laden with significance. The pocket watch, now safely returned to her possession, lay heavy against her bosom, a reminder of the past and a herald of the unspoken emotions stirring between them. A single token, so small, carried the weight of centuries of propriety, pride, and concealed desire. And then, the scandal reached its crescendo. A visiting newspaper, ever eager to embellish the lives of the elite, printed a story, "The Duke's Secret Attachments. Is Ravensshire ruled by his heart?" The phrasing was coy, suggestive, yet damning. Evelyn read it in the quiet of her chamber, a shiver coursing through her as she felt the invisible eyes of the world settle upon her. The Duke entered, having seen the same headline, his expression unreadable, yet the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm within. He did not speak. He did not need to. In the silence, both understood the magnitude of the accusation, the dangerous beauty of their connection, and the peril it carried. She turned away, her reflection in the glassed window a portrait of composure, yet with the faintest tremor of uncertainty flickering in her eyes. The candlelight flickered, shadows dancing along the polished floor, and for the first time, the Duke allowed himself a moment of quiet consideration. He had dismissed her once, publicly, in the ballroom. Now she remained resilient, dignified, and impossibly close to the fortress of his own pride. Outside, the rain subsided, leaving the gardens wet and glistening under the muted glow of the moon. The reflection of lamplight in the puddles shimmered like fragmented crystal, mirroring the fractured state of their world. Inside, a small token lay in her hands, heavy with memory, poised between past and future. The Duke watched her from across the room, silent, his thoughts unreadable, yet his presence alone was an undeniable force, as commanding as any proclamation. And in that quiet, tense interlude, the air between them seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the house itself had leaned forward to witness the first tremors of an inevitability neither dared to name aloud. A scandal, yes, but more than that. A promise of reckoning, of desire restrained, of hearts bound by circumstance yet aching to reach beyond it. The world outside held its breath. And so did they. Moonlight poured through the glass roof of the winter garden, scattering frost across roses that had long surrendered to the season's chill. The delicate fronds of ivy clung to wrought iron arches, glistening with silver dew, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and distant smoke from the library hearth. Lady Evelyn Hartwell stepped lightly over the frozen gravel, her breath misting in the cold, each exhale a fragile declaration of presence. The events of the past weeks, the whispered gossip and the weight of scandal, pressed upon her like a cloak of stones, yet she had come seeking clarity, not confrontation. The Duke of Ravensshire stood beneath the largest arch, his posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. Moonlight traced the sharp planes of his face, revealing tension beneath the practiced mask of stoicism. He had been waiting, she realized, not in expectation of apology, but for confession, though whether of his deeds or his heart she could not yet discern. He spoke first, voice low and carefully measured, betraying a vulnerability he rarely permitted. "Lady Evelyn," he began, "you have endured much these past weeks, and yet you remain." His words were more than observation. They were acknowledgment of a strength he had not anticipated. "I cannot deny that the world has treated you unjustly, nor can I pretend that my own actions have been free of complication." Evelyn's gloved hands clutched the small pocket watch at her waist, the token of her father's memory pressing against her palm like a heartbeat. She met his gaze steadily, the faint quiver of fear tempered by determination. "Your Grace," she said, voice soft yet firm, "I have not sought your mercy nor your favor. I wished only to act with honesty." He took a slow step closer, and the faint crunch of frost beneath his boot sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. "Honesty," he murmured, almost to himself. "Yes. A rare commodity, indeed." His dark eyes searched hers, as if attempting to navigate some invisible map of her emotions. "I have watched you endure what society deems shameful, yet you have not faltered. You walk this estate with dignity that mocks my own pride." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, and for the briefest moment, the cold around them seemed to retreat. "And yet, Your Grace, you do not speak plainly. You weigh words as if measuring guilt upon a scale, when perhaps they might measure truth instead." He sighed, a sound more human than she had ever heard from him. "Truth is a dangerous thing, Lady Evelyn, especially when it tempts a man beyond reason, when it beckons him toward confession he dare not render." His gaze dropped for a moment, a fleeting lapse that revealed the storm behind his restraint. "If I were any other man, I might have spoken freely. I might have declared what I feel, unburdened by duty, by expectation, by the shadow of scandal." The garden seemed to contract around them, frost-laden arches enclosing a world apart, where neither reputation nor expectation could intrude. Evelyn felt the tension, thick and tangible, as if the air itself awaited the unraveling of hidden truths. "And yet, you are not any other man," she said quietly, each word deliberate, her breath steady despite the tremor she sensed in him. "You are the Duke of Ravensshire. Bound by duty, yes, but also by fear, fear of admitting what your heart has long known." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, quickly masked by the habitual restraint of his station. He stepped nearer, closing the space between them by inches that felt like a universe. "I have feared, Lady Evelyn. I have feared the audacity of affection, the vulnerability of desire. I have feared that to name what I feel would diminish me in the eyes of all who watch, all who judge." His hand brushed against a frost-tipped fern, a tentative gesture that mirrored the hesitancy in his voice. Evelyn's gaze softened, yet remained steadfast. And yet, it is precisely this fear that binds us both. We are prisoners of expectation, of whispered opinions, of a world that seeks to define love before it may breathe. Her words, though calm, carried weight, as if setting down a gauntlet of challenge. Perhaps it is time, Your Grace, to consider the truth that lies not in the eyes of others, but in the pulse of one's own heart. His jaw tightened, a subtle tremor revealing the conflict warring within. The moonlight reflected from the watch at her waist, its silver face catching the glint of his eyes. "This," he said, voice lower still, almost reverent, "this token, a memory of your father, reminds me of what I have neglected, the humanity of connection, the honesty of the soul." He paused, drawing a breath that seemed to shake with all the restraint he had cultivated over years of propriety. "I have loved, not wisely, not openly, but I have loved nonetheless. And in my folly, I have feared the consequences more than the honesty itself." Evelyn's chest tightened, the careful composure she maintained slipping like sand through gloved fingers. She wanted to speak, to offer reassurance, to meet him halfway across the chasm of unspoken emotion, yet hesitation held her tongue. "You speak of love, Your Grace," she said softly, "and yet speak also of fear. Are we to be bound by both, forever at a distance?" The Duke's eyes darkened, storm clouds gathering behind the mask of his pride. "Distance," he admitted, voice nearly breaking, "has been my shield and perhaps my torment. I have called your name in my mind countless times, only to retreat, only to convince myself that propriety outweighs yearning." He fell silent, his chest rising and falling with the labor of unshed confession. Evelyn took a tentative step closer, the soft rustle of her gown echoing in the glass-roofed garden like a whisper in a cathedral. "Then speak," she urged, her voice steady, though her hands ached for the warmth denied by protocol. "Not to society, not to expectation. Speak to me, for I am here, and I will hear you." The Duke's gaze lingered on her, measuring, weighing, and finally conceding the restraint he had clung to for so long. He exhaled, a slow release of tension, and in the faint shimmer of moonlight, he seemed smaller, human, and achingly vulnerable. "Lady Evelyn," he whispered, almost to himself, "you are the one woman I could never think of as my wife, because to admit it would shatter the walls I have built, the pride I have nurtured. And yet," he faltered, the single word heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Evelyn stepped closer still, the frost crunching underfoot, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, hope, and understanding. "And yet?" she prompted gently, the faintest quiver of anticipation in her voice. The Duke lowered his eyes, as if measuring the courage he required to continue. "And yet, in the quiet hours, in moments unobserved, your name has been the one I call, the one I seek. My heart has betrayed me in fevered dreams and waking contemplation alike. I have feared love, yes, but I have feared life without it even more." For a long moment, silence reigned. The frost-laden roses, the glitter of moonlight on iron arches, the distant sound of the estate settling, all seemed to hold their breath. Evelyn felt the full gravity of his words, their weight pressing upon her with an intimacy that transcended scandal, propriety, and whispered gossip. The confession was complete, yet incomplete, a window cracked open, revealing the rawness of a man at odds with his own desires. And then, without warning, he faltered. His eyes clouded, and the garden seemed to shrink around him, the moonlight reflected in tears he did not yet permit to fall. I must depart," he murmured, voice thickened with emotion. "There is much to consider, and I am unprepared for what my own honesty demands." Evelyn reached for him instinctively, but did not touch. The moment demanded restraint, a recognition that some declarations must linger, unfulfilled yet eternal. "Then go, Your Grace," she said softly, her breath misting in the cold air. "And know that truth need not be spoken to be understood." The Duke turned, retreating along the frost-lined path, his silhouette swallowed gradually by shadows and distance. Evelyn remained, the pocket watch pressed to her chest, her pulse racing with the residual storm of confession. She felt both despair and hope, the bitter ache of words half-spoken mingling with the quiet promise of understanding. Moonlight glinted on the frost, the arches above her casting intricate shadows, and she realized, with a thrill and a shiver, that the world had changed. Their lives had shifted, imperceptibly perhaps, yet irrevocably. And in the silent, frozen garden, the first tremors of truth had been uttered, leaving both hearts poised on the precipice of revelation, awaiting the next daring step, the next fracture of pride, the next surrender to what neither dared yet name aloud. The fever came suddenly, unannounced, like a thief in the night, and the Duke of Ravensshire was undone. The grand corridors of his estate, usually echoing with measured footsteps and servants' soft whispers, became halls of hushed panic. Candles flickered against the shadowed paneling, casting distorted shapes upon the walls as though the house itself recoiled from the intensity of his illness. His skin burned beneath the heavy linen sheets, his breath ragged and uneven. In delirium, he called out a single name, repeated over and over, as if chanting against the cruel tides of fate, "Evelyn! Evelyn!" The dowager, white-furred and trembling, summoned the girl at once, bypassing decorum and propriety, for etiquette could not govern the desperate rhythms of a fevered heart. Evelyn arrived, stepping cautiously through the candlelit corridors, her skirts brushing the polished floor with soft whispers. She had long feared this summons, aware that to enter his presence now was to stand before a man stripped of pride, vulnerability laid bare in ways society would deem unworthy. Yet she advanced, heart-taut with equal measures of dread and anticipation. The Duke lay upon the great mahogany bed, sheets disheveled, the flush of fever painting his features in stark contrast to the marble coldness he maintained so often in public. His dark hair, damp with sweat, clung to his forehead, and the intensity of his gaze wavered in the flickering candlelight. He saw her enter, and for a moment, the fevered haze lifted just enough for recognition. His voice, low and ragged, trembled with both desire and shame. You came," he whispered, each syllable a fragment of his restraint breaking apart. "You have come to shame me once more?" Evelyn's lips parted in a breathless exhale. "No, my lord," she replied, stepping closer, the warmth of her presence defying the chill in the room. "I have come only to forgive you, and perhaps to be forgiven in turn." Her gloved hand hovered near the edge of the bed, hesitating, a gesture more intimate than words could convey. The Duke's chest heaved as he struggled against the fever, yet he reached, trembling, toward her. His fingers barely brushed the edge of her sleeve, but the contact was electric, a bridge over the chasm of pride and propriety that had long separated them. I have called your name every night," he admitted, voice breaking with the weight of confession. "And in dreams, in the fevered moments between waking and thought, I have begged for you, though I feared to name it while whole of mind." Evelyn's heart quivered, and she knelt by the bedside, careful not to disturb the sheets but close enough that her presence offered solace. "Then speak, your grace," she urged softly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion within her. "Speak freely, for I am here, and I will hear you. Not as the world commands, but as two hearts alone may converse." The Duke's eyes closed for a moment, as if summoning courage from some wellspring deep within. When they reopened, the gaze that met hers was unguarded, luminous with vulnerability and longing. "You were the one woman I could never think of as my wife," he said, each word weighed with confession, "because to imagine you as mine would have undone all reason, all discipline, all pride. Yet, my heart, my very soul, defies my judgment. It seeks you in spite of propriety, in spite of every oath I have sworn to duty." A tear glimmered at the corner of his eye, one he did not hasten to wipe away. Evelyn, moved beyond the decorum of restraint, lifted his hand, pressing it lightly to her cheek. "And yet, hear you speak it now," she said softly. "Fear no longer governs this moment. Your truth has been spoken. And she hesitated only briefly, "I am here to answer it." The Duke's fingers tightened on hers, the intensity of his grasp a silent plea, a promise, a confession beyond any spoken declaration. "In sickness, I have known no respite. My thoughts, my dreams, my very pulse called only your name. I have feared madness in the absence of your presence, yet I feared propriety more, feared the judgment of a world unwilling to acknowledge the folly of hearts." Evelyn bent closer, so near that her hair brushed the side of his face, the scent of lilac and winter roses wrapping the room in fragile intimacy. "Then let the world wait," she said quietly, her voice a balm to his fevered turmoil. Here now, let propriety fall silent. Here, your confession finds home. He struggled to rise, a wave of weakness sweeping him into her support. She steadied him, her gloved hands firm yet tender, guiding him to sit upright against the pillows. I cannot bear to hide this any longer," he murmured, eyes glistening with a combination of relief and lingering fear. "I have loved you beyond all reason, Lady Evelyn, in ways that shame my pride yet fulfill my soul. I cannot endure another night without speaking it aloud, without calling your name and hoping you might answer." Her eyes softened, the weight of understanding folding over her like a gentle cloak. "Then hear me," she whispered. "I have answered, and I have waited. My own heart, restrained by circumstance, recognizes yours. In truth, it has done so from the first." The Duke's hand fell over hers, their fingers intertwining in quiet triumph over the barriers of duty and fear. Outside, the moonlight shifted, painting the frost-laden windows with silver light, and the world beyond the estate seemed to vanish. Time contracted, leaving only the two of them in the hushed cathedral of the sickroom, hearts entwined and words laid bare. "You must rest," Evelyn said gently, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "The fever will not abate without care. But know this, I remain. I remain in the spaces where your truth finds me." He nodded, the weight of exhaustion pressing upon him, yet the faintest smile curved his lips, a fragile bloom in the fever's shadow. "Then I am saved," he whispered, voice raw and tremulous. "Saved by your presence, by your acceptance, by the courage I lacked until this moment." Silence descended, heavy yet comforting, the room awash in the pale glow of candlelight and moon. Their hands remained entwined, the pulse of connection steady between them, a tether that neither scandal, nor pride, nor fear could sever. Every unspoken word of longing and restraint now breathed freely in the intimate space of acknowledgment. A servant approached hesitantly, bearing a tray of tea, but paused, sensing the sanctity of the moment. The Duke's eyes met Evelyn's, a silent instruction to allow the world to remain at bay, if only for a few precious breaths. And in that quiet, fevered chamber, a transformation occurred. The proud Duke who had once dismissed her, who had recoiled from the vulnerability of love, now lay humbled, undone, yet illuminated by the fierce, unguarded reality of his own heart. Evelyn, equally altered, remained steadfast, a witness and participant in a confession that had reshaped both of their worlds. The moment stretched, delicate and perfect, and then the Duke's gaze fell upon the pocket watch she still held, glinting faintly in candlelight. "This," he murmured, voice soft but resolute, "has been a reminder of all I feared to admit. It is also a reminder that the heart cannot be bound by propriety alone. And now, I must recover, if only to live in the knowledge that truth has found us both." Evelyn smiled faintly, the curve of her lips tender yet victorious. "Then recover, my lord," she said, "and let us see what tomorrow brings." Outside, the moonlight shifted once more, spilling silver across the frost, reflecting in puddles on the stone paths. Inside, hands still clasped, they remained, two hearts aligned for the first time in honesty, their bond forged by confession, endurance, and the unyielding pulse of love. Yet as the candles guttered low and shadows stretched across the room, a distant, almost imperceptible cough echoed from the hallway, a reminder that while this truth had been spoken, the world beyond these walls had not yet been reconciled. And the Duke, for all his newfound honesty, felt a tremor of uncertainty, knowing that desire and propriety often collided with consequences still unseen. Spring arrived at Ravensshire with a quiet majesty, brushing the estate gardens with tender shoots and delicate blooms. Frost had long receded, replaced by the subtle warmth of sun filtering through pale clouds. Yet the Duke of Ravensshire remained confined within his chambers, recovering from the lingering effects of his illness. Days of convalescence had drawn long, filled with fevered dreams and restless reflection, during which he had called Evelyn's name more times than he could recall. He had confessed, he had acknowledged, yet the fragile thread of propriety still tugged at his pride. Evelyn had vanished from the estate quietly, returning to a modest parish school where her skills as a governess could flourish beyond the scrutiny of gossiping society. She left a note only, a mere slip of paper sealed with a faint scent of lilac. "Love does not wait for courage. It forgives, then departs." The Duke read it alone, the words imprinting themselves upon his heart, and yet the ache of absence gnawed relentlessly. He knew he must seek her, not as a duke commanded by duty, but as a man humbled, longing, and unshielded. The day of his departure dawned clear and cold, the mist curling along the carriage wheels as they rolled toward the countryside. The estate receded behind him, a labyrinth of halls and memories now seeming almost too vast, too empty without her presence to animate them. His thoughts were a tempest of anticipation, fear, and hope, each emotion tipping precariously into the next. When at last he arrived at the parish school, he found her tending a small garden, fingers brushing the tender shoots with a care that seemed almost sacramental. She turned at the sound of the carriage, eyes widening, yet her composure remained intact. The faintest tremor of recognition passed over her features, but she did not speak. He stepped from the carriage, boots crunching against the gravel, and for a moment the world contracted into the narrow space between them, hushed and taut with expectation. "Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice low, unadorned, stripped of all ceremonial constraint. "I have come not as a duke, nor as a man of society, but as one who has been undone by his own folly and pride. I have called your name each night, and now I come to ask your forgiveness, and perhaps your hand." Evelyn's gaze softened, her lips curving in the faintest smile, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. The air between them was electric, with everything left unsaid in the halls of Ravensshire, everything restrained by rank, duty, and the fear of scandal. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, the scent of lilac and spring weaving between them like a subtle declaration of hope. "Your Grace," she replied softly, "the hand you seek is already entwined with your truth. My heart has answered long before your feet reached this path." Her words, gentle yet unyielding, carried the weight of every silent moment, every unspoken glance, every gesture that had passed between them in shadowed corridors and frost-laden gardens. He reached for her hand, this time not trembling, not hesitant. Their fingers intertwined, and the pulse of connection was immediate, profound, undeniable. The weight of gossip, the sting of scandal, the omnipresent gaze of society, all melted into insignificance beneath the gravity of this reunion. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to knuckles that had endured whispers, judgment, and the passage of countless unspoken emotions. "You have given me more than forgiveness," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "You have given me truth, patience, and courage I lacked for myself. I feared once that love might undo me. Now I see that it completes me." Evelyn's eyes glistened, the faintest blush warming her cheeks. "Then let us complete what has always been inevitable," she said. "Not in the eyes of the world, but in the quiet knowledge that two hearts have found each other." He nodded, a tremor of relief coursing through him, and for a moment they remained in silent communion, hands clasped, breaths mingling, the space around them shimmering with the fragile perfection of a truth finally spoken and received. The garden seemed to respond, petals catching the morning light, dew sparkling like scattered diamonds across the tender greenery. Even the wind, gentle and warm, whispered through the hedgerows, carrying the faint fragrance of lilac and frost, of new beginnings forged in the crucible of adversity. The Duke retrieved the small pocket watch, the same token that had bridged past grievances and memory. "Your father's gift," he said, voice reverent, "has traveled through time and circumstance to reach this moment. I return it to you now, not as relic, but as promise, of devotion, constancy, and the courage I once lacked to speak my heart." He extended it to her, the silver glint catching sunlight as if blessing their union with subtle brilliance. Evelyn took it, fingers brushing his in a silent acknowledgment that all had changed. "It is more than a watch," she said softly. "It is history, love, and now our future." He breathed her words in, a benediction as sacred as any vow spoken beneath a cathedral vault. The distance imposed by weeks, by fear, by propriety's rigid demands, fell away entirely. In that moment, they were neither duke nor governess, neither society nor scandal. They were simply two souls who had endured separation, humiliation, and uncertainty, now reunited by confession, forgiveness, and the inexorable pull of desire that had always bound them. "Shall we leave the world behind?" he asked, a whisper carried on the breeze, though the weight of implication was profound. "If it demands distance, we shall not obey. If it whispers judgment, we shall heed only the truth between us." Evelyn's hand tightened around his, the gesture intimate and commanding in its simplicity. "Then let us walk forward together," she replied. "Not as the world would dictate, but as hearts unbound by fear, scandal, or expectation." He lifted her hand once more, pressing it to his lips, a final kiss that was both an oath and a release, a promise distilled into a single moment of exquisite gravity. Behind them, the estate lay silent, trees swaying gently, the distant hum of life continuing unaware of the transformation that had taken place. The corridors, the halls, the windows that had once witnessed whispered gossip, all were irrelevant now, mere backdrop to a story that had finally reached its quiet, perfect resolution. Yet even in triumph, a subtle tension remained. The future, though luminous with possibility, was uncharted. The world beyond their garden, the judgmental eyes and cautious tongues of society, still existed. They could not undo it, but they had learned that love, spoken and received, need not be contained by it. The Duke and Evelyn turned together, stepping toward the path that led beyond the garden, beyond the frost-kissed hedgerows, toward a life they would shape together. Each step was deliberate, measured, yet imbued with exhilaration. Sunlight fell upon them in dappled rays, illuminating the path ahead while shadows of the past lingered only as memory, no longer as restraint. And as they walked, hands entwined, hearts aligned, the world seemed to pause, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement of a love that had endured trials, shame, and silence, only to emerge triumphant. Outside the garden gates, the first blossoms of spring caught the wind, petals scattering like confetti across the gravel, as though the earth itself celebrated the union of two hearts long denied the freedom to speak. The Duke's voice broke the silence once more, low, tender, and resolute. "From this day forth, there shall be no hesitation, no fear. Only us, Lady Evelyn, in truth and in courage. The world may watch, but it cannot touch what has been so profoundly given and received." Evelyn's gaze met his, unwavering, serene, yet alive with the fire of triumph and hope. "Then let it watch," she replied. "We have survived its scrutiny before. Together, we shall survive all else." For the first time, the Duke allowed himself to smile fully, unguarded, unshackled by pride or fear. And in that smile, in the quiet intimacy of their shared glance, a world of unspoken promises was sealed. Their story, long bound by propriety and unuttered desire, had reached its crescendo. Yet within its conclusion lay the soft, thrilling possibility of new beginnings, of whispered confessions, of love lived not in shadow, but in the luminous clarity of truth finally embraced. And so, hand in hand, they stepped forward, beyond the frost, beyond the garden, into the morning sun, hearts aligned, souls unbroken, and the world, though still watching, rendered powerless before the quiet majesty of love fulfilled.